anyone who's remotely objective looking at this sees the only reason he was charged was because he was white, and Neely, the person who died, was black. For those that didn't know, Daniel Penny was found not guilty. So let's break down for those that have been living under a rock that maybe aren't aware of what this trial was. This occurred in New York in a subway. There was and it's important for the story, there was a black man who's sort of like a homeless type figure, who's harassing people, threatening to kill them on the train. He has attacked people on these subways before. Several people. Daniel Penny happens to be a white man who served in the military, who put him in sort of a chin lock, like chokehold from behind. At least one other person helped hold him down. The police came. Daniel Penny ends up getting arrested. Of course, Alvin Bragg, prosecutor, that's the head person that was in charge of this case of bringing charges against Daniel Penny, famously was the person who went after Trump and convicted him of 37 felonies that were garbage using a novel case law. Of course, Penny and Trump, both cases that should have never been brought. Alvin Bragg also is decreasing the sentencing, or the going after roughly 60%, I think I've read, of criminals, including violent criminals, that are occurring in his jurisdiction in New York. So basically it gets back to that old Solzhenitsyn quote. For the thief to have a knife was just a misunderstanding, but for you to have one or to defend yourself was political terrorism. They go after what's culturally or politically significant, and they allow the violent crime to run rampant. And so this case was only brought because Daniel Penny's a white man. And what's the name of the gentleman who died? I forget his name. I know that's bad form. I was just reading it again. Daniel Penny was the defendant, and the deceased is, someone will tell me in the chat here, but he was black. That's why these charges were brought. In fact, there was a case, not in Alvin Bragg's Neely, that's right, Jordan Neely. There was a case, it wasn't in Bragg's jurisdiction, but also in New York, where it was a black man who killed a violent person on a subway that was threatening passengers. No charges brought. Throughout the course of the trial, we heard just how bad the race basing was, as the prosecutor continually called Daniel Penny the white man. Imagine just for a second what that looks like. Imagine the trial of O.J. Simpson, and they're just like, the black man, O.J. Simpson here. Imagine that. Just for a second, imagine that. But this repeatedly was done throughout the trial. Also, evidence was brought that actually Neely was alive when the police got there, and the police refused to give him mouth-to-mouth because they were afraid that they could get some sort of illness. And of course, the gentleman that was holding down, you could see a picture that kind of it went viral of Daniel Penny where he's holding Neely, and there's a black man that's holding Neely's arm down as Daniel Penny's holding him. The black man wasn't charged. Nor have we heard Black Lives Matter, the NAACP, etc., talk about how that black man was violent. We haven't heard any of that. Most of the people that were on the subway thought that Penny was a hero, that he protected them. And it led to not just a broader conversation of race, but also a conversation about selective prosecutions and about the society we live in, where people don't want to help or intervene when there are violent psychopaths that are harassing people in public anymore. And so that was the backdrop for this case. We'll talk about all of that. Developments this weekend were the charge of manslaughter, which was the most serious charge. There was reports that the jury was hung on this. My guess is there was probably one person that wanted to find him guilty of that, or was still evaluating whether or not he was guilty of that. And so the prosecution did something, and as someone who's not a lawyer, I'm just taking the word for people that I'm reading online, but it seems almost unprecedented, where the prosecutor, the jury was hung on that charge. Normally what happens then is a mistrial is declared, and either the prosecution retries the case with a brand new jury, new judge, etc., or they just never retry the case, and that's it. But instead, what the prosecution did in this particular case was they dropped the manslaughter charge, basically ensuring that they could bring that charge again in the future if they wanted, and then allowed the lesser charges of like negligent homicide to continue. Now, what this was an attempt for the prosecution to say, oh, if they're deadlocked, if it's a hung jury on the most serious charge, then if we take that off the table and let them decide on the lesser serious charge, surely we'll get a guilty conviction, and then we could retry at a later date the manslaughter charge if we so see fit. But this will be a way to get a compromise verdict. And there were people rightfully outraged at this. Now, it's similar to what we saw in the Bragg case, where you even had CNN head legal correspondent Ellie Honing that was talking about how there were things going on that he couldn't believe that was coming out of the prosecution, such as the exact charge not really being clarified during the trial until basically the closing arguments. And this novel theory being brought where there was a charge that required an underlying charge that required one of 3 underlying charges, which had never been done to prosecute anyone before, and now being used for the first time to prosecute a former president and frontrunner for president. Same office. Now they're again doing questionable things. And so I thought before this morning that the outcome you were most likely to see was that Daniel Penny would be found guilty on one of these lesser charges, which would have been an outrage. But shockingly, a predominantly female jury in New York found Daniel Penny not guilty of the lower charges. Now, the first question I have, just as a matter of record, is because of the nature of how the manslaughter charge was dropped, someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure what that means is because he wasn't exonerated on the manslaughter charge, he wasn't found not guilty, I should say, on the manslaughter charge, hypothetically, the Bragg office could bring that charge again. But I have seen legal scholars saying that they think that that still could be some form of double jeopardy. But interesting to think that that could be something that could be argued by Bragg's office if they decide that they would want to continue to pursue this further. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what a stunning rebuke based by this jury of the shady prosecution strategy. Like I said, myself and the people I were reading, it seemed they were heavily suggesting, okay, I mean, think about it this way. We're locked on whether or not he committed manslaughter. We don't know if we want to send him to jail for all those years, but this lesser charge, okay. We don't think he's totally innocent or totally guilty, so we'll find him guilty of a lesser thing. So once they got rid of the higher thing, it looked like, there'll be some compromise verdict, that he'll be found guilty on some of the lower charges. But that wasn't the case, which makes it look like, probably my best guess is, there was 1, maybe 2 jurors that were really holding out on the manslaughter charge. And everyone else was like, no, not guilty. And then once the charge was brought off the table, that juror or 2 probably felt, I'm not going to persuade the rest of them. I want to go home. That's it. Not guilty. Let's be done with this. I would find it difficult to believe that it was like 6-6. 6 thought he was guilty on manslaughter and 6 thought he was innocent. But then when you get to the negligent charge, the lesser charge, that all of a sudden the 6 that thought he was guilty of manslaughter caved in. Seems that it had to be only 1 or 2 people that thought that. That seems to be the most likely scenario there. But what a rebuke for the prosecution in trying this sort of shady case. Of course, after the trial, and this gets to probably the most interesting, to me, the 2 most interesting stories here are Bragg, and again, this prosecution, and what they represent, these sort of Soros-funded prosecutors that are intentionally allowing violent criminals back on the street, decriminalizing crime, allowing bail reform to get violent criminals out, while at the same time, issues that they find to be culturally or politically significant to them, they're pressing to the fullest extent. That weaponization of our justice system that you see at the FBI is matriculating down to attorney generals, like you see with Bragg, like you saw with Letitia James, like you see with Fani Willis. That's, again, something that I talk about a lot, and it's Again, I talked about this with Scott Horton. You mentioned the name George Soros, and everyone's like, oh, what a wacky conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy, or at least it's one that's confirmed. We know that Soros organizations are funding the campaigns of many of these prosecutors, and they're running on criminal justice reform, which is allowing violent criminals to commit these crimes all across the country. Now, despite the fact that we were told over and over again, oh, actually, violent crime's down. Look at the FBI numbers. Right, that revises their numbers and whose numbers aren't matching up with the National Crime Victimization Survey, etc. We can see that even in places like San Francisco, they're ousting prosecutors that are soft on crime. They're voting for reforms that make it raise the criminal penalty and standards for property crimes and theft. People are tired of it. And it's one of those things, and this will go in tangent with topic 2, when we talk about the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO. A lot of people are seeing, I don't know how else to put this, a lot of these sort of academic types, the educated types, let's be honest, predominantly white people feel, well, it's not my neighborhood. I'm not really worried. Oh, I have a big heart for the criminal in the inner city. It's not dealing with my neighborhood. Well, now we're starting to see that it's starting to affect more and more people. And they're starting to realize, oh, we're not exempt from this. So that's the first. Of course, the other interesting part is the racial aspect of this. And Daniel Penny was only charged because he's white. And I think that it's time we say it. I've said it many times before. This idea of white privilege, the way that it's promoted from so many of our institutions, including academia, is absolute garbage. Yes, there is white privilege. There's also detriments to being white. Yes, there are disadvantages to being black. There's also black privilege. There's both privilege and detriments to being a man, a woman, a Christian, an atheist, Muslim, Asian. Any group that these cultural Marxists on the left want to say one group's an oppressor and the other group's oppressed. The truth is, all groups are simultaneously oppressed and oppressors at the same time. That's the truth. Not to equal levels. For example, if you're born with a crippling, debilitative disease, of course, that's more harmful to you than any advantage you get from that. But the idea that it's just black and white, well, if you're black, then you're always oppressed, and everything's a disadvantage for you in the United States, is nonsensical. And it's been for quite some time. And we have to pretend over and over. There's this great lie that we're all forced to engage with. And it's been going on for years. We have to pretend that Kamala Harris lost because she was a black woman. We can't look at the fact that she was basically put there because she is a black woman. That's why she got the position in the first place. We had to pretend that Barack Obama being a black man was a huge detriment to him. And ignore the fact that there were many, many people that were so enthused and excited to vote for him merely because he was black. They knew almost nothing about him other than that. Same's true of someone like Hillary Clinton. We had to pretend that being a woman was a huge detriment to her while ignoring the positives. The same's true with hiring practices. Oh, black people are far less likely to get jobs. What type of jobs? Because almost any serious company, especially one that's dealing with large amounts of money, like Fortune 500 companies, if there are two equally qualified people, they'll be chomping at the bit to hire a minority. It looks good for their company. There's a reason why people of Asian descent, Hispanic descent, etc., Asian descent's a better example, pretend to be other races when they're applying for college. We all know it. As a white person, if you fill out a resume, any minority status that you could claim is beneficial to you. It's not harmful to you. We know that, but we have to pretend. Now, is it true that there could be lower level jobs like working for a gas station that the particular employer says, I would rather have a white person? Could be true. But we have to pretend the narrative only goes one way. The same is true when it comes to law enforcement. We've known for years, despite the narrative, that far more white people are shot by police and killed, unarmed white people are shot by police and killed than black people. Doesn't matter. The proportions aren't that stark either. And when you look, I'm sorry to say it, the truth is, when it comes to violent crime, Police are probably more likely to use both appropriate and inappropriate violent force when they're in areas where there is more violent crime. Those are areas disproportionately lived in by black people. It does not make you a racist to say this. In fact, quite the opposite. If you're unwilling to try to diagnose the problem, the people that are most likely to be victims in those areas, also black people, never end up getting any justice or safe communities. For years, academia and the lefties, by claiming you're a racist from trying to talk about any of these things and pushing the narrative of defund the police, have made it more likely that inner city black communities have rampant crime. I was called a racist because I was against riots that were occurring after George Floyd that were predominantly occurring in black neighborhoods, including with outsiders from people like in Antifa who weren't even black, who were going into these communities and rioting. It was racist for me to say, I don't like that rioting. Instead, the anti-racist position was, oh, you have to support the rioting. It's the voice of the unheard. How dare you? By the way, where are all those people when those communities suffer? Where are they now? They there helping rebuild them? Or are they like, what was that woman's name? Patricia Collars from BLM that made millions of dollars and built some houses and out now. Now we're out. By the way, it's very similar to the origins of the pandemic. It was racist to suggest that a lab that was partially funded by the United States engaged in gain-of-function testing, which could have led to the creation of the pandemic. That was considered racist. The non-racist narrative was a bunch of backwards Chinese people ate pangolins and bats at a wet market. That was the non-racist position. Now we have this situation with Daniel Penny. Anyone who's remotely objective looking at this sees the only reason he was charged was because he was white and Neely, the person who died, was black. And that's been the narrative. The NAACP came out. There were chanting at the jurors, threats being issued. We're likely to see some form of riot with this as the precursor. Hopefully not. Because in the eyes of the perpetual grievance culture that's pushed by these cultural Marxists, all they see is white man killed black man. Therefore, white man must pay. They don't look at the guy who was helping Daniel Penny hold down Neely, who happened to be black. They don't look at who the victims would have been had Daniel Penny not intervened. Pure racism. That's what it is. Do you remember the Rittenhouse story? So there's a left-wing streamer that I've interacted with a couple times named Vosh. And I remember, I don't have this pulled up, but I remember Vosh debating, maybe he was debating Destiny, or maybe it was someone else, I don't remember, but I remember seeing this clip. Now, the Rittenhouse story was he is open carrying legally. Guy starts screaming at him, threatening him. He tries to run from the guy. He hears a gunshot go off behind him. He turns around. The guy is still chasing him, lunges for his gun. He shoots. Then he gets on his cell phone to call for help. A crowd forms. He runs from the crowd towards the police, and they chase him again. He points a gun at a guy who's pointing a gun at him. The guy that's pointing a gun at him points away. Then he looks over at another person that's trying to attack him, and he goes back to the guy who points a gun again and shoots. Vosh said, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, but I seem to recall him saying that Rittenhouse's duty was to sit there and allow the mob to do what they were going to do to him. And if that meant they beat him, I guess just pray. That's your duty. And make no mistake about it, that's how so many of these cultural Marxists think. So when you see the video over and over and over on a subway of someone on the side of the street, violence that's occurring on the street, some woman will be harassed and everyone's like, why doesn't anyone intervene? Would you? Would you intervene?